All right. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you. Um, so, we finished the 1950s. Guys all went to spring break. Hopefully, you enjoyed that spring break. So, the book is it's a little weird, but I understand why they did it. It's sort of organized thematically, meaning it's not entirely chronological. Um, because we ended with the assassination of Kennedy. Now we have to go back to the 50s because things are kind of on top of each other, overlapping. And so they go by theme rather than by pure chronology. So we got to go back a little bit and talk about civil rights. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Um, as I'm sure you guys are well aware, race is sort of the perennial issue in America. Other countries have other issues, religious strife, ethnic strife along different lines. America, the black-white divide has been this great chasm that unfortunately continues to this day. I mean, I spent the last few days watching the trial of Derek Chauvin, um, the police officer who killed George Floyd, and you see these issues with us today with racial disparities and in every field essentially. Um, and this starts really in 1619 with the first African slaves that were brought to not even the United States at that time, into colonial British America at that time, colonial English America. It wasn't even Britain at that time. And this issue has stuck with us for 400 years, 402 years now. We do make a progress along the way. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you do have to recognize that despite our faults and our troubled past, America has tried at various stages to take a crack at this, to try to, make things better. One of these great leaps forward was Reconstruction, the period just following the Civil War, lasting about 12 years and eventually falling apart. The era that would replace Reconstruction was a huge step backward, though, the era of Jim Crow. Um, that would last until about the 50s and 60s. And then there was a concerted effort by civil rights groups, the federal government, to destroy and split apart this awful system, which was done state by state. It's rather bizarre. Um, we don't even have a good name for this in America. In South Africa, they have this term apartheid, right? It's a really harsh term, frightening. It sounds really bad. Ours is Jim Crow. It's just a person's name. It doesn't sound too terrifying. Um, Also in South Africa, this was a national policy that the national government implemented. In America, it never was. Slavery, there were certain laws regulating slavery at the federal level, but not much. Most of that was done at the state level. And then after Reconstruction fell apart, Jim Crow was essentially established state by state. So it's very odd. Each state is different. Northern states are different than southern states, and southern states are kind of different from one another. It sounds insane, but what black and white were defined as varied from state to state. So I forget exactly what it was, but in some states like Virginia, I think it was like 1/16th African ancestry meant that you were black. In other states, it was 1/8 or 1/32. So literally, you could change race from state to state, which is just insane. And I think you guys all know nowadays that race is what we call a social construct. There's actually no biological definition. Every time that you've tried to come up with this idea of how to define different, quote, races of humans, it all falls apart when you actually subject it to scrutiny. It has no meaning. Certain peoples have different features, but that doesn't seem to have any meaning on ability, intelligence, or anything else. So this is a picture here of Martin Luther King, the man probably most responsible for unraveling this awful Jim Crow system through grassroots movements, but there were several others that helped along the way. We'll go over all of them. So let's talk about a few of the successes that we would get in this sort of early era. Remember how bad it was in 1954. Just 1954. I'm not even. You don't even have to go back to the 1890s. In 1954, there was not a single black sheriff or police officer in the entire South, and hardly any in the North either. Remember that most political machines had sort of groomed the Irish to be the police force in most metropolitan areas, Boston, New York, Chicago, etc. A lot of Captain Kelly and Captain Malone and, Sergeant O'Hallahan. Not too many African Americans. And still to this day, there's these disparities, but there are, you take a town like Baltimore or Atlanta, and it's extraordinary. I wish that civil rights leaders of the past could see that today, Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, a Black woman, is the mayor of Atlanta, a segregationist state, a Confederate state. It's incredible. They got a Black police chief. Same with Baltimore, a Southern state, Maryland. So we have made progress, but it was really bad in 1954. Heavily segregated. Black people, by and large, could not vote in the South. They could in the North, but not in the South. Sharecropping system was falling apart because of mechanization, but that still did not mean that that there was full equality. Now, there were some steps forward, right? Some symbolic ones. The military had been integrated in 1948. Harry Truman did that. The year before, Major League Baseball was integrated in 1947 with Jackie Robinson. By 1959, every last Major League team has at least one Black player on the team. The quote unquote Negro leagues fall apart. That was the name of the Black Major League, division that was totally separate and distinct from the American League or the National League. That falls apart in the early 50s. And so there's a bit of progress, yet still most of the Jim Crow facade is still there. And then we get the very famous Brown versus the Board of Education. There's actually two cases that come out. One is the decision, and then one is sort of like how to implement the decision. So this horrible separate but equal doctrine that is set up in Plessy v. Ferguson is finally overturned in 1954. And I'd like to give a shout out to Earl Warren and to California here. Earl Warren was the governor of California in the 40s. And he had risen up through the ranks of the Republican Party. He probably should have been vice president under Eisenhower. Ike and him were very, very close friends. But Richard Nixon outmaneuvered them at the convention. Earl Warren hated Richard Nixon for that, never forgave him. And Ike said, you know what, I don't like Richard Nixon very much, but he's young, he's vibrant, he's, famous on television. And so I need his support and all of his supporters' support. So tell you what, Earl, next spot on the Supreme Court, you got it. And it just so happened that Fred Vinson, the Chief Justice, died in 1954, opening up the top spot on the Supreme Court, which is extraordinary because Earl Warren had never been a judge. He had a legal degree, had been a prosecutor in Alameda County up in Oakland, all during the 30s. But he had never been a judge, and now he's Chief Justice. So Earl Warren, wonderful Chief Justice. He's, right up there with John Marshall, probably the most famous and most consequential, second to John Marshall. But this is because he didn't care about the law very much. He just did what was right. Most judges would look at this and say, is segregation supported or not supported by the Constitution? And Earl Warren would just say, it's wrong. It's just wrong. In a democracy, we shouldn't have it. Even if the Constitution doesn't explicitly forbid it, we're America and we shouldn't have it. And that's kind of the way he thought, just right and wrong, literally black and white, So he decided that the Supreme Court was going to do this. Now note, it's the Supreme Court. Congress is not acting, the president's not acting. It's very ironic and bizarre and backward, you might think, that the least democratic institution, remember, Supreme Court justices are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and they serve for life. They're never elected. And they're the ones that are going to take this huge leap forward for equality. Why? Precisely because they don't have to stand for election. Ike couldn't have done this because he had to stand for election. He had to go to southern states and ask them, please vote for me. And in the South, they didn't let black people vote. They only let white people vote. And so Ike knew that this was a loser for him. If he took a strong stance for civil rights, he doesn't win election or re-election. Same thing with Congress. Congress is composed at this time, probably a third. And if you talk about the Senate, it's probably 40% were hardcore segregationists. They would have never passed a law that would have overturned this. But the Supreme Court is 9 members who are totally insulated from public opinion, particularly Southern public opinion. And so they acted unanimously. And they made a ruling that this little girl, in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, could not be barred from going to the school that was close to her. Kansas uh, had segregation laws like every other state, most other states. And this girl and her family, they lived very close proximity to this whites only school, and they had to drive all the way to the other side of town to go to the black school. They just thought this is a huge burden. It's an inconvenience, and it's my right because I pay taxes to support the local school, and my kid can't even go there. This is ridiculous. So the Supreme Court said 9-0, separate but equal is a doctrine that's got to be overturned. And by implication, pretty much all segregation laws for the entire South were overturned by this decision. It was a monumental case. It was huge. But understand how cases work. It's not what you might think, where the Supreme Court says segregation's unconstitutional, and then you snap your fingers and the whole country's integrated. What it did was it integrated that school district. That's it. Now, you might say, well, what use is that? Well, here's the way that the legal system works in America, according to this. All other districts have lawyers that pay attention to these cases, and to stay out of trouble, they then alter their behavior. So they stay out of court, right? Like I remember, for instance, about 10 years ago, LA Unified got sued because they basically were shuffling kids into TA programs that would, give them credits. And like some kids were seniors and they were like TA for 6 separate periods, and they weren't even taking academic classes and therefore not graduating. And so the parents sued the district, LA Unified, and then there was this huge announcement in Long Beach, well, you can't do TAs anymore more than like 1 year, and you have to make sure you have a 3.0, et cetera. And I remember when all this edict came down, I immediately said, what did LA Unified do? Because this happens constantly. LA Unified screws up, and then we have to alter our behavior in Long Beach, so we stay out of court. And you want to stay out of court for 2 reasons. Number one, it's expensive. You got to hire attorneys, and LBUSD needs to pinch every penny for children and for teachers. We don't have money to be paying lawyers for these ridiculous lawsuits. Second, it's embarrassing. When you get sued, you're in the Press Telegram and the LA Times, and everybody sees, oh, they're getting sued again. That's a bad school district. So you want to stay out of court for that. Now, when it comes to segregation, Southern states just don't care about either one of those things. You can't shame people with no shame. You can't say, ooh, stay out of court. They were like, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. They don't care. It's the foundation of their existence. You have to understand also that people get very unreasonable when it comes to their kids. I didn't get this until I had a kid, but when you tell adults you're going to have to change your behavior this way, that way, usually we grumble and we accept it. But when you say your kids are going to have to do this, people lose their minds, because when your kid is exposed to any amount of danger, parents expand it tenfold. And I get it. It's hard to understand when you guys are your age, but when you have a child, it's like there is something that's not you, that's outside of you, that you care about more than yourself, and you are not there 100% of the time to protect them because they are a separate person, yet you care about them more than you care about your own life. So it's terrifying. That doesn't excuse the segregationists, but they just said, we're not standing for this. We are not integrating our schools. I want you to note also that this was Kansas that was integrated. Kansas was not a Southern state. They never had slavery. You guys might remember Bleeding Kansas. As it was a territory, there was a huge civil war, you might want to call it, within the state of Kansas over it, but the federal government never made it a slave state. After the secession of the South, it became a free state in 1861, but it never had slavery. It had segregation, but understand, Kansas was not a cotton growing state, so they never had a big black population, right? Like my dad's from Kansas. He grew up in Pratt, Kansas, and I remember it striking. I found a picture once. My parents are moving, and it was my dad's kindergarten class. My father's born in 1943. He went to kindergarten in 1948. And I remember this class photo of all little 5-year-olds with my dad. And there was a little black kid in the class, little black girl. And I was like, wow, this is, before Brown v. Board, wasn't there segregation? And he said, well, in our town, there was one black family. Everybody knew them. Everybody got along with them. And they were just like, we're not going to build an entire school for one kid. That's insane. So they just let the kid into the school. And most of the parents were okay with it. In Kansas, it's not a state where if you integrated the schools, Kansans would go out and riot, right? That would be Mississippi or Georgia or Louisiana or Alabama or South Carolina. It would not be Kansas, kind of a Midwestern state where people just shrugged their shoulders and said, okay, that's the way of things. Earl Warren was very clever in saying we can't have our first case be in Mississippi where we order this and people are rioting and the law is not followed. We have to set a standard that, look, we ordered it and Kansas complied, which they did. So a lot more work has to be done. Then you have this horrible event that galvanizes Americans. This was the lynching of Emmett Till. It's an incredibly tragic, very, very sad story. Emmett Till was a young boy from Chicago, 15 years old. He's born in 1940. In 1955, he was 15 years old. Mom was a single mom, and she sent him down to Mississippi to visit his cousins for the summertime. She's a single mom. She's busy working in white people's homes in Chicago, mopping floors and cleaning toilets. And so she sent Emmett down there. And he'd never been to Mississippi. He did not understand that the rules were very different there. He actually went to an integrated school in Chicago and he had white friends. And so he didn't get it. So when he went to Mississippi, he went into the front door of a store, which he did not do. Black people had to go through the back. He did not understand that you do not talk to a white woman. You don't look her in the eyes. And he did. And we're still not clear about the entire story, but there might have been some flirting going on where he whistled at her and he called this white woman baby. He was 15, she was a grown woman. So word got around town very fast. The white woman did not like that this young, brash black kid was talking to her that way. She told her family, and her husband and her father kidnapped Emmett, showed up at his door in the middle of the night with a flashlight and a gun, asked for the boy, got in a pickup truck with him, and they murdered him. They dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River, where he was missing for several weeks. His body finally surfaced and he was weighed down with a cotton gin. And eventually the body surfaced. It was horribly swollen and disfigured, but he still had his ring on his finger with his initials, E.T. Emmett Till, which his mother could identify. So it's very clear. We know the last people that he was seen with. We know who did it. But in Mississippi, you had to be a registered voter in order to be on a jury. Black people couldn't vote, so they couldn't be on jury. So it was an all-white jury who sympathized with the white woman and her family, and they just didn't care about any of the evidence. This is an open and shut case. And they just said, not guilty. Now, it's sad to say, but this is not even an extraordinary case. This kind of thing was rather common in the South. We talked about lynching before. Now, it had slowed down a bit. It was starting to peter out. Really, once World War II started, this was a practice that was becoming less and less common. We were becoming at least somewhat more civilized. The sharecropping system was very much weakened by the Great Depression and World War II, right? Like the government said, we can't have all these young black men picking cotton in the South. We need them in uniform. We need them in LA making boats and ships. We need them for the war effort. We can't be doing this. And so the government invested in mechanized methods of cultivating cotton. And so sharecropping was largely dying out, not entirely. There were still sharecroppers as late as the early 70s, but it was largely dying out. The reason why Emmett Till crystallizes with us is because it got so much media attention. We're in the television age now. We're in the radio age. It was not only picked up by the national press, but by the international press. So you didn't have lynch victims in the 1890s who Northerners went down and paid attention to it. They ignored it. And the international press didn't care either. Now you had French, journalists from Le Monde, and you had British ones from the London Times. You had German ones from Der Spiegel, and they're all showing up in Mississippi to cover the court case, as well as Chicago and New York and LA journalists. And they just can't believe. They're like, is this America? This is unbelievable. A segregated all-white jury is going to pass judgment over these two white men who murdered a little black teenager. And that was America. And it was highly publicized, and it galvanized people, particularly the black community. There were hundreds of thousands, millions of black folks that this was the moment where they said, we're not taking this anymore. A lot of it had to do with World War II. I mean, there were millions of black men that served their country in World War II, and they just said, I risked my life in New Guinea fighting the Japanese. I'm not going to be scared of this anymore. I'm not backing down. I'm just not doing it anymore. I'm a hero, I'm a veteran, and I risked my life already in a war, so I'm not, you know, playing afraid anymore. And so the first moment you see, Emmett Till is murdered in the summer, I believe in August of 55. In December of 55, you have your first widespread protest of segregation. It starts in Montgomery. Montgomery's in Alabama. And in December of 1955, they had a boycott of the bus lines. Now, this is a city bus line, and about 80 to 85% of the passengers on the bus lines every day were Black. Why is this? Because white people basically have enough money to buy their own cars. You know, you have basically segregated jobs, right? White folks get the white collar jobs and Black folks get the blue collar working class jobs. And so most Black folks don't have the money to afford their own transportation, so they ride the bus, and the buses were segregated, as I'm sure you know. They had two doors, you know, one in the front of the bus, one in the back. Black folks were supposed to step onto the front of the bus and pay the driver, and then step off and then go to the back and then enter there. As the bus filled up, Black patrons were to stand up and offer their seat to any white patron. And so it did not matter age, it did not matter gender, meaning if you are a 90-year-old Black woman and there's a little snot-nosed white brat on the bus, you know, a 7-year-old or something like my boy, not that he's a snot-nosed brat, but you know, he's half white and he's, you know, a little 7-year-old, he should be standing for the woman, I think, so she can sit. And no, they would say, doesn't matter. White is more important than Black, and you have to offer your seat. If you don't, you're going to be arrested because that is the law. Mostly people just went along with this because this was established in the 1890s during Jim Crow. This was the standard. Everyone, you know, lived and died under this system, and people didn't question it. Finally, Black people questioned it and said, no, we're not doing this. And so they decided to stage an incident, basically, right? Rosa Parks, this woman who was a seamstress and a member of the NAACP and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it was agreed that she would be arrested. She was well known. She had a great reputation. And so Rosa Parks decided, I'm not standing up. She just refused. She was arrested. And of course, the NAACP was right there at the police station and photographed her. Since she was well known, these pictures went out all over the community, and people were just incredibly upset that Miss Rosa got arrested. And so that night, the Black churches were filled in Montgomery saying, what are we going to do about this? We can't stand for this. And it was agreed that they would fight it with the boycott, which is an all-American thing to do. If you look back at the Revolution, how did the Founding Fathers first protest the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and the Sugar Act? They refused to buy those goods in an organized fashion to put pressure on the British to change their policy. Same here, we're 80% of the dollars on these bus lines. If we, the Black community, refuse to ride, the bus lines will collapse and all the poor white folks won't be able to get to work. It'll shut down the whole economy of Alabama. And so not a single Black person in Montgomery rode the bus for an entire year, for 12 months, which was just extraordinary. They had an incredibly elaborate system of carpooling, van pooling, where the few Black people that did have cars would basically ferry people back and forth all day. A lot of Black women who were maids asked their white bosses, the women whose homes they cleaned, would you please give me a ride? And then when the white woman showed up to pick up the Black maid, they'd say, oh, well, here's 4 of my friends and they all work on your block too. Can they ride with you? And most of the white women would be like, all right, just keep your heads down so nobody sees me. You guys have to understand how revolutionary that was too, that if you were white, you could not even offer a Black person a ride. It was just considered taboo. It wasn't illegal, but people got lynched for that kind of stuff. Now, the only way you could get around this is if you had a pickup truck. The white person driving would allow the Black person to sit in the bed of the truck like an animal, but not up front in the cab and in the passenger seat. You just couldn't do that. You would get stares, you'd get comments, you get the KKK burning across on your lawn, even if you were the white person. And so white women risked their own lives doing this, which, you know, is pretty important as well. So finally, after a year, the white community of Montgomery still didn't give in, but the NAACP sued Montgomery and asked them, hey, what you said in Brown v. Board, that segregation is now unconstitutional, do you mean it for buses too? The Supreme Court said yes, and the Supreme Court ordered that the buses be completely integrated. So what you have now is a wonderful encapsulation of what is happening. You have a state law, the state of Alabama has this policy, and it's being simultaneously attacked on two sides, right? From the bottom up, you have protesters that are attacking it, trying to put pressure through the boycott to change, so from the bottom up. But then you have the Supreme Court hammering them from the top, and then they kind of, I don't know how you want to say it. You got them in a vice or sort of an anvil where you crush the system between those two things. And that's basically what will happen. It'll just take 10 years of this process. But in the very beginning, that's kind of how you have the recipe for how this is going to work. Now, the Montgomery boycott was December 55 through December of 56. The next year, we have a huge test case in Arkansas. Now, Arkansas, a southern state, a Confederate state, they did have slavery and segregation. But they're not the deep South. Following what happened in Montgomery with their buses, Little Rock voluntarily integrated their buses. They didn't even have to get sued. I want you to see that there's different levels of racism, so to speak, right? The North is still a racist society. It's highly segregated through redlining, it's highly prejudicial in job opportunities. But lynchings were incredibly rare in the North. They just, by and large, just did not happen there. I mean, you had race riots and other problems, but lynchings were like an unheard of kind of thing in the North, at least at this late date. In the Midwest, it's, largely like the North, like Kansas, so they just shrug their shoulders, okay, we'll integrate. Arkansas is a little bit more intense. And then when you get down to the deep South, right, it's a gradient. The deeper South you go in America, the more intense the feelings of racism and prejudice are. I'm not saying that's the case today, but it certainly was, 70, 80 years ago. Now, Little Rock integrated their bus lines. So believe it or not, the NAACP, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress of Racial Equality, all these Black civil rights groups, perhaps they were naive, but they thought there'd be no resistance in Little Rock because they thought it was an enlightened white society. Bill Clinton, was from Little Rock. He was born in Hope, Arkansas, but his family moved to Little Rock when he was a teenager. And he witnessed all this. And he, was one of these white kids that thought, what's the big hubbub? Just let the Black kids into our school. So the schools were a different story. They were just different. The bus lines, white folks were okay with the integration, but when it came to the schools, they just, all hell was going to break loose. So in the fall, in September of 1957, Central High and Little Rock had to be integrated. The court system ordered them to, the federal court system. Now, the first day of school, the Black teenagers show up. There's 9 of them, 7 girls, 2 boys, handpicked. The NAACP handpicked these kids because they said, we want to make sure we have the best and brightest Black students in the entire state of Arkansas. Why? Because we don't want the school to have any reason to expel you, right, for bad grades or for bad behavior. They trained the kids to take abuse and not fight back, to be nonviolent under every possible circumstance. And it still wasn't good enough, right? 2 Black boys, 7 Black girls. Why'd they pick 7 girls? So it would seem non-threatening, right? Girls would be less of a threat than boys. Didn't matter though. There was an angry mob to greet the 9 children the first day they showed up, hurling insults at them, calling them all kinds of awful stuff, police and military barricades keeping them all back. When the students got to Central High, the governor himself is there, and he's ordering the National Guard to not let in the Black children. This federal court order is unconstitutional in his mind, and he's there to, quote, nullify it. You guys remember the doctrine of nullification going back to 1833, right? If a state doesn't like it, a federal policy, they can block it. You go all the way back to 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, Virginia and Kentucky passed these resolutions saying, you can't enforce those laws in our state, right? The Civil War should have totally killed the doctrine of nullification. I mean, secession was the ultimate act of nullification, but the South is going to revive it here. And the governor tried to overturn this. For a week, this happened. The 9 black kids get dressed, they walk to school, they get to the front, and there's literally military armed guards, the National Guard of Arkansas, there saying, we won't let you in. Now, you're Dwight D. Eisenhower. You're the president of the United States, and you're being made to look a fool by this hillbilly governor from Arkansas who's named Orval Faubus. I mean, if I was going to write some sort of comedy about Southern rednecks, I couldn't have picked a better name than that, right? You guys know your redneck names? Like Maynard, Zeke, Cletus. You know, there's some names where it's like, dude, you can't be anything but a hillbilly with that name. I'm sorry if I'm being kind of offensive, but it's kind of true. If you got 2 first names like Billy Joe or Jim Bob, you might be a redneck as well. Orval Faubus, that ain't a sophisticated guy from the north, right? Orville, like Orville Redenbacher or Orville Wright. It's like, that's a Southern name, right? And he was making Ike look like a fool, and Ike took it personally. Ike was thinking, I'm the guy that beat Hitler and the Nazis, and there's this podunk little redneck governor from Arkansas who's trying to humiliate me by defying my Supreme Court. Eisenhower himself did not agree with the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Ike was no hardcore segregationist. He was from Kansas. He was from, you know, a Midwestern state, but he just felt that the Supreme Court was moving too fast and that, you know, it was just an unwise decision. But he couldn't be made to look a fool, and the law was the law. So Ike becomes the first president since Grant, Ulysses Grant, to send the army into the South to enforce the civil rights of Black people. This is what makes the civil rights movement, in my opinion, Reconstruction 2.0. That's what Reconstruction was. It was using federal power, the federal court system and the federal army, and the Freedmen's Bureau, of course, to enforce the rights of Black people in the South against the states that they lived in, because the states were terrible. And so the army comes in, the roughest, toughest people in the army, the 101st Airborne. These are people that paratroop behind enemy lines. Like at Normandy, they're parachuted the night before the D-Day landing. A lot of people don't know this. D-Day was June 6th. The night before, on June 5th, a few thousand men parachuted into France without any artillery or air cover or anything behind enemy lines. I mean, these are no nonsense kind of people. And they're there with their machine guns on the campus to enforce the rights of the Black students. I think this is wonderful. If there is a positive side of the military industrial complex, it's that the federal government is going to use that power to enforce. It's not like Reconstruction where they said, well, we don't have more than 15,000 soldiers. Hey, this is the Cold War. We got hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Let's do this. So pretty much every Black student had an armed military guard with them, which if you talk to the Black students today, and they've been interviewed, you know, countless times, they said it was wonderful because it protected us. It made me proud to be an American, but they kind of got in the way and they couldn't be everywhere. These were male guards. They couldn't go into the girls' locker room or anything like that. They couldn't go into the bathroom. And wherever they did go, it was kind of a barrier for the Black kids getting to know white students, right? It's kind of odd when you're like, hi, you know, my name's Janie and I'd like to sit down and meet you. And here's my guard with a machine gun, right? That's a little intimidating. So it certainly is not ideal. It's not practical, but the law is being enforced. It was a chaotic year at Central High. One of the Black kids got expelled because she dumped a bowl of chili on the head of a white kid that was calling her the N-word. And so she got expelled. And the crowd outside, when they heard about it, rejoiced. Somebody went out to a stationery store and got thousands of little buttons printed up that said 1 down, 8 to go. Like, we bullied this one kid out and we got to keep up the pressure, so 8 more will drop out. There was an angry mob outside Central High every day, 180 days. Some people came from 2-3 states over. There were license plates that said Mississippi and South Carolina and Georgia. Can you imagine how empty your life is that you would get in a car and drive 2-3 states over to yell at Black teenagers for going to school? Get a life, please. Finally, the year ends. The first Black graduates from Central High walk across the stage. And then the governor figured out a way around this whole thing. The governor announced as soon as graduation had ended in May, he sent notices out to all of the children in all the state of Arkansas, and they said, any state that, or any school that's being ordered to be integrated, this was such a disruption of the learning environment, we're going to close the school. Finding a clever loophole, right? That you can't integrate the school if it's closed down. We don't have to have a school. We can just close it, right? Now, the governor's trying to say it's not because I'm racist, it's because I'm trying to alleviate all of the chaos that's going on in Arkansas in my community. But really, it was a way that segregationists could drag their feet on this, right? Because at the same time, segregated facilities all over the South are being sued and they're one by one integrating, right? The public swimming pools were segregated. The public beaches were segregated. The libraries were segregated. The schools, the drinking fountains, the bus terminals, the bus stations, the restaurants, and I could go on and on and on. The hospitals. I think there's a passage in your book, it might be the old version of the book, but it basically summarizes it like this. It says that Blacks and whites lived in totally separate worlds from cradle to grave. Blacks and whites were born in separate hospitals that were segregated, and then when they died, they were buried in separate cemeteries. I want that to sink into you guys. It's beyond anger. I just feel sorry for you if you're honestly worried about who is buried in the same cemetery as you after you die. Like, that's a sickness. You have a problem. And by the way, it makes no sense, right? Like, the theory was that if Black people are buried next to white people in the same earth, it would somehow contaminate the process and white people wouldn't be able to get into heaven. Okay, this process that you're describing, how does it know where the cemetery gates are, right? The earth is all connected. So can the Black cemetery be right outside the gates? Does it need to be 5 miles away? The theory makes no sense. It's bizarre. Probably what it really was that white people going to grieve their dead loved ones didn't want to have to rub shoulders with Black people who were there grieving their loved ones. But whatever the process, that's just a sickness. It's very sad, actually. And so one by one, these entities were being sued and they were being told, you got to integrate. And what they did one by one is they just said, oh, our swimming pool has to be integrated. Okay. They would drain the pool, fill it up with cement and say, it doesn't exist anymore. We're going to sell off this to some parking lot association that will turn it into a parking lot. We don't have a school to integrate anymore. We don't have a pool to integrate. We don't have a library, right? Your library's got to be integrated. They would just sell off the books and bulldoze the building. No joke. This is what they would do. From like 58 to like 61, 62. And finally, the Supreme Court said, you cannot destroy a public facility in an effort to attempt to stop the integration of it. And so finally, that is overturned, but it took a couple of years. In the meantime, you have other incidents. The Supreme Court got bold in 1960. There was a little Black girl, Ruby Bridges, 6 years old, one girl, not a teenager, one girl, a 6-year-old that was told, who told the school, we're suing you. The Supreme Court agreed. They had to allow her to go. And they had a full riot in New Orleans that this one little Black girl went to a first grade class in New Orleans. So we're still a ways off from actually overturning this entire system. If people are absolutely determined to not follow the law, it's impossible to enforce it. It just is, right? I mean, you guys probably know this from all the mask mandates, right? The mask mandates work in areas where people agree with it, but go to Huntington Beach, right? I live in Orange County. A lot of people think that COVID is a hoax and that the masks don't work, and they just refuse to follow it. You can't send tens of thousands of police officers to arrest every single person not wearing a mask. It just won't work. If people are absolutely determined, you just can't do it. So it was going to take more time and more effort and more energy. Then we have the sit-ins. The 60s are a decade of hyphen-ins. This would be the first, the sit-in. Then would be the teach-in. Then would be the love-ins. They would be be-ins. We'll talk about all those later, but the sit-in is the first one. What I love about this is that it was created by college students, not by Martin Luther King, not by any civil rights group. It was just a fascinating tactic just made by a bunch of Black students in college. This was at Greensboro, North Carolina, at a Black college that was there. And you have to imagine, if you were Black in the early 60s, this was the universe you were living. This was exciting times. Black folks knew they were living in the most momentous time in the entire history of Black people living in America, that they were on the cusp of this moment of achieving the shattering of Jim Crow and some measure of equality. And so they were talking about this in their dorm rooms. And one of them just came up with an interesting idea. Like, North Carolina had segregated facilities, the businesses, right? Public facilities were now being ordered to be integrated, right? The libraries, the swimming pools, the schools, things like that, anything run by the government, right? Let me take a step back and explain this distinction. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution says no state shall deny equal protection of the law. That means state governments cannot discriminate, and any creature of state governments, right? So that's the public libraries, the courts, the public schools, anything that's owned by the government. What about private businesses? What about restaurants that want to segregate and discriminate? What about hotels, etc.? 14th Amendment doesn't apply, and there's no legislation that orders that. So how do you get Woolworths to integrate? Now, you guys may not even know what Woolworths was, but Woolworths used to be the biggest department store in America. Their headquarters in New York City for a time was the tallest building in the world when it went up in 1914. Imagine kind of like a Nordstrom, but they had like a cafe in every one. Like, you could do your shopping for clothes and for kitchen appliances and all kinds of stuff like that. You buy your washer dryer, you get your new suit and tie. And then there's imagine like a Ruby's Diner where you go and you sit down and you order your food. And because it was the South, Woolworth could decide on their own that they want to serve Black patrons, but Woolworth was a big national corporation. In the North, it was completely integrated. Black people in New York City could walk into any Woolworth, sit at any lunch counter. In North Carolina, you couldn't. And they just said, well, we're a business and we want to follow the customs. And so the Black students said, what if we went to Woolworth, sat at the lunch counter, and refused to move? This is known as nonviolent civil disobedience. It's a wonderful tactic that was invented here. Now, some people would say, well, this was borrowed from Gandhi, right? Gandhi was using this in the 40s and to bring down the British Empire in India. That's true, but Gandhi borrowed it from an American, Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau was one of these transcendentalists in the 1850s and 40s. And he came up with this idea. If you read his book, Walden, it's about this basically. And during the Mexican War, he refused to pay his taxes because he didn't want to support that war, a war for the expansion of territory for slavery, right? So this is a very old tactic. It had been 100 years old at the time. These Black students were reading about it. And so they said, we're going to go to the lunch counter. We don't need to hurl a Molotov cocktail through the window and assassinate people. That'd be the worst thing that we could do. We want to be inside of America, not outside of it. We don't want to form these rebel bands that try to overthrow the state of North Carolina. We're going to collapse the system by going in and getting arrested. And we're going to demand jail, not bail, meaning if you pay bail, that gives money to the state and they can hire more police to arrest more of us. But if we fill up the jails, they can't arrest us all. There's a capacity and we'll crack the system. And so they did it. They went down, sat at the counter, and they said, hi, I'd like a sandwich and a glass of milk. We don't serve colored folk here. And they just refused to move, just smiled and just sat there. And white folks didn't know what to do because Black people always complied with the law. Now you had massive non-compliance. So the owners of Woolworths called the police. The police came out and arrested all the Black kids sitting at the bar stools. And then another wave of Black students sat down and they were arrested. And paddy wagons are filled up. People are taken to jail. The jail's filled up. And within just a week or so, this completely collapsed the system. Woolworth issued a letter that they would no longer segregate in any of their stores anywhere. And once Woolworth did that, most of the other big corporate chains did. And so you're starting to see a big change happen. It's truly extraordinary how young college kids can just change the world. So let that be a lesson to you. Don't get sucked into, video games and the party scene in college. You can change the world if you apply yourself. So Martin Luther King very quickly picked up on this and he started to use it. He said, well, I have an army of church supporters in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so they targeted city by city. They would pick a city. They went to Atlanta first in 1961. And they did this. They would just have people walk into stores that would not serve them, sit down, get arrested. And then one by one, these cities would be integrated. Okay, so this is a long, tedious process, but there's progress being made all along the way. Then you have the Freedom Riders. This is interesting because this is not even nonviolent civil disobedience. This was nonviolent civil obedience, meaning according to federal law that was passed in the 40s, any international or interstate travel had to be integrated, right? Because understand our federal system, right? States could have their own segregationist policies. But when you cross state lines, then the federal government can come in, right? So if there's a city bus in Montgomery that's going back and forth within the city, cities can determine the laws there. But once that bus crosses state lines, the federal government comes in, right? Now, this may seem weird to you. It's like interstate buses. Who on earth takes an interstate bus, right? Like hardly anybody does this anymore, right? Like I'm asking you guys, just think in your own mind, have you ever been on like a Greyhound and left LA and like gone to Houston, Texas on a bus? We just don't do this anymore. It's cheaper just to fly. In the 60s, it was way more expensive to fly. We don't even have time to get into all of this, but in the 30s, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, decided that air travel was so, as a business, was so unstable. There was a lot of like airlines that would show up and then they go out of business because of the unions, because of the fuel prices, because it's a very unstable industry, that the government came in and just artificially set prices. And this was the law from the 30s to the 70s, where plane tickets cost the same no matter where you went, right? Or no matter what airline you took, right? So if you flew from LAX to JFK, right? LA to New York, identical price for every airline, whether it was TWA or Pan Am or whatever. And it was set artificially high so that the businesses wouldn't go out of business. And so what did you have? You had, I don't know if you guys have ever seen these pictures or video of what air travel was like in the 50s and 60s. It was like a penthouse in the sky. They had wonderful leg room. You weren't all crowded together. You had wonderful sumptuous meals and everything else. Why did you have that? Because businesses couldn't compete on price. So why would you pick Pan Am over TWA? Because the service is better, right? By the way, gasoline was like this too. I don't know if you've seen old movies, but you used to just drive in your car and you would park right by the pump, and then you would ring a little bell, and this army of teenage boys would come out and jack up the car and check the oil and, you know, wipe your windshield and gas up your car and light your cigarette, give your kid a toy. Why did they do that? Because gasoline was exactly the same price. Like 1 gallon of unleaded 87 octane was identical and uniform throughout the US. So how do you compete? How do you get people to go to Exxon versus Texaco, right? You give them better service, right? This all falls apart in the 70s, and so you have competition, but this is why this was done. Now, because of those regulations, air travel was for the richest people in America. Like no poor person ever flew back then. So people took buses. The working class, the poor, even the middle class largely took these interstate buses or trains. And those were integrated. In the late 40s, federal law said that the terminals and the buses had to be integrated. So this group of people called Freedom Riders, they were black and white people together, civil rights workers, and they got on a Greyhound bus in DC, and they announced that they were going to go on a big loop through the South. They were going to go due south from DC to Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and then hook westward and go through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and just do a big loop through the US. And they get off at every terminal, every stop. They go into, like blacks would go in the white section and whites would go in the black section to test this, because those were illegal on international and or interstate terminals. So again, this is not even disobedience, it's obedience. They're just following what the law said. And of course, they were beaten brutally by angry mobs. At every single terminal they got off, there was angry mobs there that would beat them up, throw Molotov cocktails into the windows of the bus. If you guys don't know what that is, that's like you have a bottle and you fill it up with gasoline and you dip the rag in the gasoline and put the rag in there and you light it and then you throw it. Okay, I've never done this before. It's not like I'm the expert on it, but I've seen movies and stuff. And this is what they did. They firebombed the bus. Everybody ran off. They were beaten brutally. And then when the sheriffs came, they arrested the Freedom Riders and not the racists that beat them up. And amazingly, the federal government did nothing because there was no federal law against any of this kind of stuff, which was awful, right? JFK is president and he's not really even doing very much for this. He's just, kind of sitting by. His brother, Robert Kennedy, is the attorney general, and everything's just documented, but no laws are really passed to change any of this stuff. Then you get James Meredith. This is one Black man who wanted to attend Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. No Black person had ever attended Ole Miss, ever in its entire history. And we're not even dealing with children again. These are adults. And James Meredith was an outstanding individual. He was a Korean War veteran, a fighter pilot. He had been distinguished with medals of honor, and he wanted to go to the University of Mississippi on the GI Bill so that he could better himself and get a good job. It's the all-American story. And like what most segregated states would tell their, talented Black people, they would usually say, well, we have a Black college here, right? Or you go to Tuskegee, or you could go to, Howard or Fisk, or, any of these ones. And James Meredith said, I don't want to go there. I want to go to Ole Miss because it's the best university in the state of Mississippi. And that's where I want to go. And I have all the grades to get in. The only thing I don't have is white skin. So he sued, NAACP sued state of Mississippi, and the Supreme Court said, yet again, we meant what we said in Brown v. Board, you got to integrate, and all hell is going to break loose in Mississippi. They play all kinds of games with his registration. They try to not allow him to go. They try to find all these problems with his forms. Finally, U.S. Marshals and the Army escorts him onto campus when there's an away football game, when like most of the school had traveled to the next town over to go watch the Rebels. By the way, that's their mascot. It's the Confederate soldier. You talk about these symbols, right? The game ended, and all of the people in their pickup trucks are coming back. It was hunting season, so they all had guns on the back of their trucks. They come back, they see all the media vans, they see all the military jeeps, and they know Meredith must be here. I think your book calls this a riot. This is beyond a riot. This was an out-and-out battle, like an insurrection, right? People went and grabbed their guns and they just started firing indiscriminately at the news reporters, at the military. Meredith was pinned down in an administration building for several hours with a bunch of FBI and marshals like on top of him trying to protect him. And it's amazing. You can actually find this, but JFK actually called up the governor, Ross Barnett of Mississippi, and said, you got to call off the mob. You have to get the National Guard out there, send them away. And the governor just refused. He just said, well, you're stirring up trouble here, and these people are good citizens. They're just upset about this stuff. And he just refused. Kennedy had no choice, and he sent in the army. He sent the army in, and the army militarily occupied the University of Mississippi and protected Meredith and saw him through all 4 years of college and protected him. But it was kind of interesting. This was sort of, many people have said this was almost the last battle of the Civil War. It was sort of a last spasm of anger. And then after it was spent, that was it. They kind of had to throw their temper tantrum. And I mean, it was quite the violent temper tantrum. I mean, 2 people were killed. There was a French journalist who was shot in the head and killed just for being there to cover the story. Someone else, I forget, was murdered as well. And there's several people injured. But after the cavalry came in, after the US Army came in, it was like, that was it. Kennedy sent, I forget how many, 5,000, 3,000, does it say here? Right? So more than 30 people shot, 2 people killed, 5,000 soldiers sent in. I mean, and that finally just broke the back of the Southern spirit, and they just kind of stopped. And Ole Miss has changed a lot. It's rather extraordinary. I mean, quite literally, the white population tried to murder James Meredith for attending. And now if you go to Ole Miss, if you go to Oxford, there's a statue of Meredith in the middle of the campus, and he's the hero. So I do want to give some credit to the South. I don't want to stereotype them anymore. Yes, there are some racists in the South. There's racists all over America. This trial that I just mentioned, the Derek Chauvin trial, that was not in Memphis, Tennessee, or in Atlanta, Georgia. That was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in a very progressive state that's very liberal. So, racism comes everywhere. The South has changed a lot. And weirdly enough, of all the regions of the country, it's the most integrated today. If you go to school in the South, you're more likely to go to an integrated school than any other state. We are very atypical. One of the cool things about Long Beach is that the district is coterminous with the city, meaning that the city is the district. And so you get a lot of movement from within the district. So you get schools like, Wilson and Milliken and Lakewood that are fairly well integrated. It's not perfect by any means. And that's cool because you allow a bit of freedom of movement across. Usually what happens is what happened to Los Alamitos, right? I don't know if you guys know this, but Los Al used to be part of Anaheim Union. And Los Al, most of the kids come from Rossmore. It's an incredibly conservative community. I don't know if you guys know that, but every time I drive up and down Seal Beach Boulevard, there's a huge crowd still. I mean, I'm giving this lecture to you on March 31st. And still, there's people with their Trump 2020 banners who say, "Stop the steal, the election was stolen, COVID is a hoax," etc. That's Rossmore. It's a very, very conservative area. And they did not want to have their kids going to a school that was part of a much larger district that took their money and distributed it throughout. And so they basically seceded. I forget when this was. It was, I think, in the 80s or so. But they basically said, we're breaking off and forming our own district so we can go there. And so what happened? I did my student teaching at Los Al. It's weird to me. I mean, I'm a white person, but I grew up in Garden Grove where a third of my school, Garden Grove High School, was Asian, a third was white, a third was Hispanic. We had hardly any Black students in Garden Grove, but at least it was integrated in that aspect and being Asian and Hispanic. Los Al is not like that. It's like over 90% white, which is very weird in Southern California for me because it's a little pocket that they broke off and formed their own district. That's how most of America is. That's just the way it is, right? The South is very integrated. Long Beach is, but it's abnormal. It's an anomaly, right? So let's go to 63. How am I doing on time? I want to make sure okay, 56 minutes. We're doing good. Then you have Birmingham. This would be an incredibly violent situation that would happen there. Now, what had happened basically one by one, the bigger cities in the South basically integrated in the early 60s. Atlanta was first in 61, and Martin Luther King and his followers went like city to city. They went to Houston, they went to Dallas, they went to Columbia, South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Memphis, etc., one by one. And pretty much every big city in the South had become integrated in 61, 62. The biggest that still was holding out was Birmingham. Birmingham was a pretty big sized city, a couple 100,000 people, I forget the exact population, had one of the largest steel producing facilities in the country. Birmingham was right up there with Pittsburgh and Cleveland in steel production. So it was a pretty well-to-do city, but it was still segregated. Blacks did not go to the downtown area, couldn't go into any of the shops, et cetera, et cetera. So I want you to get why this is so important, because you can't boycott a shop that won't serve you anyway. Right? Boycotts will work if you're riding a bus that you're allowed to. You got to do nonviolent disobedience to go to a store that won't allow you to go there, right? Now, as an aside here, I don't know if you guys saw the movie Green Book. I still have not seen it. After it won Best Picture, I tried to rent it, and it was like $15 to rent it. And I'm like, forget that. I'll wait till it's cheaper. And I never got around to it. I've heard it's a good movie, although there are some issues with it. But what's interesting about it is the movie does show you, this is insane to me, but because there was so much segregation throughout the South, and understand that almost every Black family has relatives in the South, right? Because Black people were held in slavery in the South, and then many of them moved to the North later, but the family ties are still there. So most Black people tell you like, yeah, I got family in the South. What if you want to visit that family and you have to drive from Chicago to Mississippi? That's a long drive. And once you start to enter, Missouri and Tennessee, hardly anybody is going to serve you. Hotels, restaurants, even gas stations are just going to say, we'll let you fill up the gas, but you can't use the toilet, right? And so most Black people had to just pull off at the side of the road, which, is humiliating enough for a man, but for a grown woman to have to just squat in a field somewhere and go to the bathroom like an animal, incredibly undignified and insulting. And so what they did is that these books were published called Green Books, and it basically was the Black Motorist Guide to the South. And they would tell you where the few places, so you had to actually schedule your trip. and say, I have to stop here and then here and then here because these are the only restaurants, hotels, whatever that will serve me. And if you stopped at the wrong one, it could get you killed. I mean, it was really a dangerous thing. Now, what happened to that book? It's obsolete today because you have the right to go anywhere today. Businesses cannot say we don't serve Black people anymore. They get in big trouble for that, which is a good thing. Birmingham just did not want to integrate. Now, there's still no federal law telling businesses they can't, but the civil rights groups are putting pressure. So there was a huge protest there in the summer of '63. And they decided to get children involved too, because it was the summer and the kids are just hanging out anyway. And so thousands and thousands of Black teenagers and children would go out. And basically what they do is you couldn't go to the white park, the nice park on the nice side of town, and they would just go and hang out at the park. They'd hang out in the downtown area. They would just walk in front of stores with like placards that, would say, we want integration now. They would walk into stores and sit down at lunch counters. And so the sheriff, Bull Connor, his name's Eugene Connor, but everybody called him Bull as a nickname. He literally unleashed the dogs, got the German Shepherds, got the fire hoses. They're really called water cannons, the high pressure ones, right? Yell at them through a bullhorn, get out of the park, this is illegal. And when they refuse, you get the high pressure water hose and you just knock them off their feet and they go tumbling for 20 feet, right? Or you unleash the dogs on them and they're biting them. Each one of these protesters was trained to not fight back, no matter what. And the media was invited so that you get pictures like this that are wonderful for sending your message home. This picture, as they say, a picture speaks 1,000 words. This picture speaks 1,000,000 words. I mean, if you look at this picture, you've got the Black youth here, clean cut, looks like a nice kid. He's got a cardigan sweater on, nicely dressed. He's being viciously attacked by a German Shepherd, right? The dogs that are always used by totalitarian forces, right? The Nazis, the Gestapo, the SS. The Belgians used them in the Congo to hunt down resistance fighters. You've got this guy here with the aviator shades and the ball cap. I almost feel bad for him because he's in every history textbook to the end of time. He's Mr. Racist. He was probably a good husband and father. But because he lived in those times and he followed what the law was, this wonderful picture was taken of him that you could send out to anyone in the world and they know what's going on in the picture. They can see that this Black youth is doing pretty much nothing and he's being viciously assaulted by a violent animal and this guy is accosting him. This is Mr. Racist right here. I don't even know the guy's name, but he's the racist dude in the picture. That was wonderful for putting pressure because millions of angry Americans phoned their congressmen, wrote letters and telegrams and said, I don't want to see this anymore. And TV drove a lot of this because every time you turn on I Love Lucy, we interrupt your regularly scheduled programming to bring you this. And they would show you what was going on in Birmingham. And people's mouths just fell open and their Swanson TV dinner just fell out of their mouths. And they said, what is happening in America? Black people are getting accosted and attacked because they're in the park. What sense does this make? And so this was genius by civil rights groups led by people like Martin Luther King to train people to not fight back, because then once you're getting in a tussle with the police, then it gives white people the out to say, well, they're being violent and they deserved it, right? There's no excusing this from the photographic evidence. We can see what's going on there. So this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Then there was a very violent confrontation. At first, it went peaceful. Finally, the city, the business owners, the Chamber of Commerce just said, we're getting boycotted. Our businesses are hurting. No Northerner wants to visit our town anymore. Okay, let's negotiate a truce. Let's integrate. And they finally did. The Klan that was in Birmingham was so upset that the city had sold out that they did an unspeakable act. They tried to assassinate Martin Luther King. They put a bomb in the basement of the church that he was working out of in Birmingham. He wasn't there when it went off, but there were 4 little Black girls playing in the basement and they were all killed, all murdered. And what had up to this point been a nonviolent protest became very violent the next day. When word spread around town at what the Klan did, murdered 4 little girls, Black people got violent. They started tipping over cars, breaking windows, lighting fires. As you might imagine, people just have their limits. And then Kennedy sent in the army. Kennedy sent 3,000 troops into Birmingham because he was terrified there would be an enormous race war in the South, and he had to kind of tamp down the rhetoric there. This was August 1963. Martin Luther King then said, I need to recapture the spirit of this movement. I'm calling for a march on Washington. And so the word went out, every civil rights group and several groups that weren't civil rights groups. There were several northern churches that were all white that were just sick and tired of this and they wanted their country to be better. The unions, the AFL-CIO, the UAW, all the major unions pushed for integration as well. And 250,000 people came to a massive rally in DC on the Mall, on that strip of land. It's like a park that runs from the Congress all the way up to the Lincoln Memorial. And Martin Luther King went there and gave his very famous I Have a Dream speech. Now, if you actually read the I Have a Dream speech, because very few people actually listen to the whole thing, they just, listen to the few of the sound bites. What he's actually saying, what Martin Luther King's actually saying there is it's an address to the president, basically saying, I am sick and tired of asking Black people to put their lives on the line when we need help from our government. We need federal support. We need a federal civil rights law. Like, why do I have to go and tell thousands of Black people, hey, risk you and your children's lives by protesting this, when we could just have the FBI come in and they got the guns and they can just say, hey, stop segregating. We need a federal civil rights law that will integrate all the businesses. Now, Kennedy actually endorsed the idea right after the march. He said, I'm in support of it, but as I've said about JFK, brilliant head of state, but he did not really understand how Congress worked that well, and he didn't understand how to make deals. And this is one of these, bizarre things that happened, but his assassination, terrible though it was, did open the door for civil rights. Lyndon Johnson gets in there in November of 1963, and within 8 months, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was not easy to pass. He had to fight long and hard and make a lot of deals. But because he was a Southerner from Texas, and because he understood these people and been friends with them for a long time, he could deal with them, and he cut a deal with them, basically. And finally, we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the most consequential laws ever passed, not only in American history, but in human history. It is one of the most important laws ever. Here's what it does. Now, there's a bunch of parts of it, but let me go over the most important ones. So again, hopefully you guys understand how the law works in America with respect to civil rights. So you have two categories, private and public, right? Private means, businesses, public means the government. Public entities were already being integrated through the 14th Amendment, right? Basically, the Supreme Court rediscovered the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Remember, it was passed in 1868, but we had just been ignoring it. Plessy v. Ferguson was a deliberate ignoring of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Finally, in 1954, the Supreme Court said, oh yeah, it does technically say you can't treat people different because of race. States stopped doing that. And the Supreme Court one by one was ordering that. But what about the businesses? That's maybe even more important in America. I've said this numerous times, but I feel like businesses can oppress far worse than the government, right? How often have your parents had a fight with their bank, with the cable company, with the electric company, with any of these, right? Every time I go to CVS, I have to flag someone down to ring me up, right? It's like, where is the employee, right? You got to wait in line for 45 minutes and it's ridiculous, right? So it's important to get businesses to integrate as well. Title II, this outlawed discrimination in public accommodations on the basis, now it's public accommodations means private business, it's just a weird legal term, on the basis of race, color, national origin. Okay, not gender and not religion. And there is a private club exception to that. But basically what this would do is integrate businesses, and it would stop discrimination on the basis of being a customer. So you would have the right to frequent any business you want and spend money. Now, what's this thing about religion here? It gets very technical, but let's say that you are not Jewish and you want to go to a Jewish deli, right? I'm not Jewish. What if I go to a Jewish deli and I want to order some non-kosher food, right? I want a ham sandwich and a glass of milk. And the person behind the counter would say, we can't serve you that food because we don't have pork here. It violates a kosher rule. And if you're going to eat meat, you can't have milk with it. That's another kosher rule. Under that law, if it said religion, then I could sue the Jewish deli and say, you're discriminating against me because I'm a non-Jew. You won't serve me the food I want. And so they just decided to leave religion out of it. And they decided instead it would just be race. And they didn't include gender either in that one because they thought there would be like gentleman clubs or whatever, you know, He-Man woman hater clubs where they didn't want women going in there. And so they just left that out. But nonetheless, this ended discrimination in public or public accommodations, private businesses. So for instance, now there's an entire department of the DOJ, the Department of Justice, called the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights. This is their entire job, is to find businesses that discriminate and fine them. So you don't have to go in and sit in and demonstrate anymore. It's very easy just to, back then you would go to the yellow pages and basically look up what's the number for the DOJ, Office of Civil Rights. You'd call them and then agents would be out there in a couple days and they would shut down the business if they just wouldn't follow the law. Now, I'll give you a couple examples of this. These examples might be 15 years old or so, but I do remember Denny's got in trouble for discrimination. And by the way, Denny, who the hell are they to discriminate against anyone, right? They should be happy that anybody is at their business eating their slop. Forgive me if you guys like Denny's, but you know, Denny's is discriminating. It's like, what? Next thing, Waffle House is going to be discriminating, right? If you guys don't know Waffle House, it's a widespread chain in the South, and it's basically a gas station bathroom that happens to sell waffles. It's pretty disgusting. Who are these people to discriminate? But they did. This was maybe 15, 20 years ago. Studies showed that when Black families would come into Denny's, they would not get seating preference, right? They'd say, okay, wait 10 minutes. And then a white family would come in. They'd say, right away, sir. And they would seat these people. Now, what they found was, through an investigation, they found some internal memos where waiters and waitresses would say, I don't want to serve Black patrons because they don't tip. I want white folks. Now, what came out in the court case was that there's a grain of truth in that, but what they found out was A, Black people don't make as much as white people in America. So, you know, they can't tip quite as much. And second, Black people get worse service. And so they tend to tip less, right? And so there's a grain of truth in it. I don't want you to say Osborne said Black people. I'm not saying that, but in this particular circumstance, it seemed to be the justification for what, you know, the white waiters were telling the hosts and hostesses, right? Don't sit them in my section. And so they were like, I'm going to get yelled at if I sit them in, you know, your section. So I just won't seat them. They got in big trouble for this. Denny's had to spend all this money improving their image, and they got in all kinds of trouble. This happened more recently, maybe 10, 12 years ago at, and forgive me, I always get them confused, Hollister or Abercrombie and Fitch. They seem the same to me. I don't know. They found some internal memos again where they showed that they did not want to hire Black people to work in Hollister or Abercrombie and Fitch because they wanted to promote this sort of California beach image, and all of the models they had in their artwork were all white, and they wanted all of the people that were working in Hollister and Abercrombie and Fitch to be, you know, that white preppy kind of look. So they just had a flat policy that basically said, don't hire Black people. And they got in huge trouble for that. They got sued. They had to apologize. They had to spend all this money. So this is how the law works today. Now, most businesses don't want to get sued because it's embarrassing and it costs money, so they comply. But when it does happen, then they get into huge trouble. The government comes. You don't have to have a sit-in or demonstration anymore. You just call the FBI and they take care of it. Title VI, outlaw discrimination in programs receiving a federal financial benefit. So this is interesting. There's a couple of these things that fall in this weird nebulous zone. They're not private business and they're not government, like charities. These are called nonprofit organizations, right? So this would be the churches. Churches are not businesses, but they're not government either. This would be the Red Cross. This would be, you know, these pretty big entities. And so, and private universities as well. Private universities are not, like USC, et cetera. Those are not businesses, but they're also not the government. Could they continue to discriminate, right? Because you could say, well, University of Mississippi has to allow Black people, so what about the private colleges? We could still discriminate. Not after this. If you receive a federal financial benefit, and that is defined as a penny, like if you get a tax break, and every charity, every private university gets some federal tax break, you get the tax break, you can't segregate anymore. So that was pretty impressive as well. And Title VII, outlawed discrimination in hiring, firing, pay, promotion, or other condition of employment. This is on the job, right? So if Title II is your right to be a customer, Title VI is your right to be a student or not be discriminated by a charity or church, Title VII is your right to work. Businesses cannot discriminate. There's a bit of a problem with this, and that is it's very hard to prove discrimination, right? Meaning, what if you have a business and you got an all-white workforce, but you just say, well, we're not discriminating. It's just all the white applicants have better credentials, right? Which is quite often the case because of the legacy of discrimination. Black people don't have education in the numbers that white people do, et cetera, right? They suffer from poverty more, et cetera. More likely to be arrested, more likely to be sentenced. So you have a criminal conviction, et cetera. So because of all of this, there's other reasons. It's like, oh, I didn't refuse to hire the guy because he's Black. It's because he's not qualified and he had a felony, right? So can you just prove it with statistics? Can you just say, well, look at, this particular business in Memphis, Tennessee. It's literally Memphis is like 70% Black and the business is 100% white. Can you infer that with statistics? The Supreme Court has gone back and forth on that and said different things. For a while there, they said, yes, you can infer it just with statistics. You don't have to prove intent. You can just prove it in kind of a macro statistical way. Later on, the Supreme Court said there has to be some kind of connection with intent. You have to show that somehow the person was a racist and intended to do this. Whatever the case is, though, this was a huge leap forward. At least we have a legal precedent. We have a law now where we can prosecute this kind of stuff. So we don't need sit-ins and demonstrations anymore. The federal government has tremendous power and authority. So this was tremendous. Probably the biggest flaw of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was that there's nothing in there about voting. Voting just did not show up. And it doesn't, for whatever reason that I'm still a little bit, and I have a degree in American constitutional law, voting for some reason doesn't count as a state action when you would say, well, the 14th Amendment would cover it because you're treating people differently. I think the main loophole there is that the laws don't say Black people can't vote, but the laws say you got to pay a poll tax, you got to pass a literacy test, grandfather clauses, all that stuff. And none of those laws technically say Black. So still in Mississippi, 95% of Black people could not vote, even after the Civil Rights Act. So this would be a huge flaw, but don't worry. Next time we'll talk about the Voting Rights Act of 65, which would change all this, okay? All right, so we made good progress. That took about an hour 17. I think I can finish up the lecture next time. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We'll handle the last slide and then we'll go into kind of the next era on the next one, okay? All right, guys, good to be with you. Enjoy your spring break. Actually, probably listen to this afterwards. Hopefully you enjoyed your spring break. See you next time.